Welcome to the inaugural webcast of the new and exciting Carnegie Council Artificial Intelligence and Equality Initiative. I'm Wendell Wallach, a Carnegie-Uehiro Fellow, a scholar at Yale University's Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics, and Senior Advisor to the Hastings Center. And I will be co-directing this project with Anya Kasperson, a Carnegie Senior Fellow who recently stepped down as the Director of Disarmament Affairs from the UN in Geneva. Through this initiative, we will explore whether AI can be deployed in ways that enhance equality or whether it will exacerbate structural inequalities and create new forms of inequity. This is a multifaceted subject. We will build, of course, on existing empirical research, but we're more interested in developing a comprehensive understanding of the ways emerging technologies are impacting equality than in answering specific wonkish questions. For example, whether a technology that automates jobs falls within a specific definition of what is or is not AI is far less important to us than the fact that AI systems are or will impact every aspect of modern life and are amplifying scientific discovery and the deployment of biotechnologies, nanotechnologies, and other forms of innovation. When most people think about this subject area, the first thing they think of is technological unemployment. Technological unemployment is a term that was coined by the British economist John Maynard Keynes in 1930. And with it, he wished to refer to the long-standing Luddite fear that each form of technology would automate and destroy more jobs than it creates. Over 200 years, even though that fear has come over and over again, this has not occurred. Nearly every technology has created more jobs than it destroys. And yet many people think it's different this time. Different because artificial intelligence can replace cognitive skills, not just manual labor. When I think of technological unemployment and who might be best to present this to our audience, the very first person who came to mind was James Manyika. James is a senior partner at McKinsey & Company, chairman of the McKinsey Global Institute, and a member of McKinsey's board of directors. And though I have met many of the leading scholars in this field, I know of no one who can talk about it as comprehensively or has thought about it as deeply as James. He and his team have produced a series of reports for McKinsey, specifically about the future of work in the US and in the EU, but also about how technology is impacting the social contract, the explicit and tacit understandings between citizens and their institutions. So without further ado, I would love to turn this over to you, James.
And Wendell, thank you very much for having me join you for this webcast. It's a real pleasure and a delight, and I've enjoyed all the times we've had a chance to speak about these issues. I thought I might start just with my own brief background into AI. Many, many years ago, I did my PhD in AI and robotics at Oxford University. And I remember at the time we were starting to think about how new ways of developing AI might make a profound difference. We're working on neural networks, we're working on what was then at the time, deep learning, reinforcement learning, how you could use these neural networks to actually make profound progress. And this was back in the early 90s. And since then, I've ended up doing what I do, where I spend most of my time looking at the intersection of these technologies and their impact on business and the economy. And AI itself has actually come a very long way. As you know, the term itself was coined in 1956 at a conference that McCarthy and others had in Dartmouth. And they were trying to find a term that was different enough from one of the terms that was being used at the time called cybernetics So they thought to call this artificial intelligence. So they went through a kind of a period of profound excitement in the early 60s and so forth about the possibilities, led to, as you may remember, films like 2001: A Space Odyssey and so forth. But after that followed a period that was considered sort of a period of AI winter or winters, where not a great deal happened. And then progress picked up again starting in the late 80s and the early 90s. The work of Udea Pearl and others were starting to use Bayesian systems to think about how do you do learning differently. Work by people like Jeff Hinton and others trying to use neural networks as a way to teach these systems to learn. So we made a profound progress, and now here we are, and everybody's very excited about the possibilities. We've had announcements coming up so fast and so often about the breakthroughs. But I think one of the things that's been quite striking has been this question of how does this all intersect with the economy, and what are the impacts on the economy? And I think in thinking about the impacts on the economy, well, first and foremost, the progress has been astounding in terms of the applications we all get to use, the technologies we all live with now. In fact, AI is actually more pervasive than we realize, everything from the recommendation engines to a whole, we talk to our machines, we talk to our phones, it's already here. And so the impacts for us in terms of utility, but even in the impacts for business are quite profound. We've done research, Wendell, where we've looked at, what could the impacts be on business, and the impacts are profound in terms of increased productivity, utility, cutting across all sectors of the economy, all kinds of business in sales and marketing, in operations. It's pretty profound. So the impact for business is relatively clear, which is it's quite profound and impactful. When you look at the economy as a whole, the expected impact is also expected to be quite significant, partly because, as you know, the way the economies grow is largely a function of increases in labor supply and growth in productivity. In fact, this is the kind of work that people like Bob Solow and others won the Nobel Prizes for, where essentially what you want is you want to have productivity growth coupled with increases in labor supply. The two work together. They give you a kind of GDP economic growth. And at the time where we are now, with population starting to age, the key ingredient of what's going to drive economic growth going forward is going to be productivity. And productivity has been sluggish. And AI technologies, well, technologies in general, but AI in particular, and all these technologies that drive automation are in fact expected to be one of the key contributors to productivity growth at a time when we can no longer rely on labor supply growth because of aging populations and so forth. So the potential contributions to economic growth is actually quite profound. Then you get to the big question, which is where you started, which is, but what does this mean for work and employment? And the fear about technological unemployment has been around for a very long time. And here, let me go into some details a bit, because we've been doing some fairly deep studies over the last several years to try and understand exactly what the impact of these technologies on work would actually be. And I should say, by the way, we're not alone in doing this. Many, many others have done similar research, and whether it's the OECD, researchers at Stanford and MIT, and a few others have done the work. But let me describe what we've done, which is in some ways is analogous to what many have done. So we started by thinking about not so much as jobs in terms of what's going to happen to a welder or what's going to happen to an accountant, but rather to start with the actual activities. Because if you think about work, the work you do, Wendell, what I do, or any of us do, it typically is a combination of many, many tasks. So we took the task level view, and on that we looked at something like over 2,000 plus tasks and activities. There's a great data set called the ONET data set and a few others where you can actually understand the constituent activities that make up any occupation. So if we then looked at all those tasks and tried to understand, with the potential for technology, how much of that could be automated as these technologies make progress. And what we found, having looked at the potential rates of automation along with what those technologies could do, we came to a few conclusions that if you look at the activity level, something like 50% in an economy like the United States, 50% of the constituent activities that make up work could in principle be automated with technologies that have already been observed, developed today, and are probably on tap to be deployed in the next couple of decades. That's 50% of the activities. And I should emphasize that this is activities, not jobs. Keep in mind, again, that jobs are made up of a combination of activities. Now, when you apply this back to actual occupations, and we did this using the Bureau of Labor Statistics data, what you then find is something like there's only about 10% of occupations that have close to more than 90% of their constituent activities that are automatable. And that's actually important to keep in mind, where these are whole occupations where all the activities could in fact potentially be automated. That's about 10% of them. There's another 60% of occupations where about a third of their constituent activities can be automated. So what does this all mean? I think where it nets out is something as follows, and we actually wrote about this in one of our reports. We called it jobs gained, jobs lost, and jobs changed. And let me describe each of this. I'll start actually with jobs lost. It is the case that there will be occupations that will decline in terms of how many are required, because as automation progresses, we'll have some job declines. That's hard to dispute. We're also going to have some jobs gained. You pointed out that throughout the history of technology, one of the things that happens is as technology advances, the demand for some occupations grow, and new other occupations are created. A good example of this, by the way, historically, is if you look at what happened with the bank tellers. It's a wonderful historical example where if you had looked back in 1970, you might have said, well, with the advent of ATM machines, we're no longer going to need any more bank tellers, because it was the case, if you had looked at 1970 or thereabouts, that something like the vast majority of the activities that bank tellers actually did was mostly to count your money, either to take it from you, to give it back to you. And so you would not be wrong to think that, well, if most of that is being done by machines, presumably we're going to need few bank tellers. Well, what actually happened was between 1970 or thereabouts up until the early 2000s, the number of bank tellers actually grew. And the reason they grew was because the demand for retail banking actually went up, and we opened more branch banks and so forth. And so the demand for certain activities, even as they change, can actually lead to job gains. So there will be jobs gained, there will be jobs lost. There'll also be jobs changed. The jobs changed part is quite important because, as I mentioned earlier, we found that something like 60% of occupations have some portion, about a third, of their activities that can be automated. And so as portions of people's activities get automated, the remainder of what remains changes in terms of what kind of activity it is. Again, the bank teller example is quite illustrative. While the bank teller may have used 80% of their time in 1970 counting money, today they don't do that very much. They actually spend their time doing other things because the occupation itself has changed. So when you put all these pieces together, jobs gained, jobs lost, and jobs changed, do we end up with technological unemployment? Well, we found that at least for the next several decades, the answer is no. In fact, there'll be more jobs created, jobs gained, than there'll be jobs lost. And that an important part of what we need to think about are the implications of that still. So if you ask me, Wendell, do I worry about a jobless future over the next several decades? The answer is actually no. Not that we should ever stop worrying about that. We should. But is that at the top of the list? No, it isn't. So what is at the top of the list of things that I worry about when it comes to AI and work? Well, there are at least about 4 things, and let me describe what they are. The first one is the fact that because of the jobs changed nature of what I just described, what we just talked about, we're going to need to develop an incredible ability to adapt skills. And so that's why the conversation about reskilling and skills adaptation is absolutely critical. Why does reskilling and skills and education matter? Well, it matters for a couple of reasons. One reason is because as some jobs decline and others grow, workers are going to need to have to have the skills for the jobs that are growing and the jobs that are changing. So the skills and education is a critically important part of the adaptation that needs to happen. So that's number one. The second thing that's going to be important is how do we manage these work and occupation transitions? Because as we know, some occupations are going to be declining, some are going to be growing. So how do we enable and make it easy for those transitions as people move from one occupation to another to work as smoothly? This, by the way, is one of the things that I think the world didn't do as well through globalization. We didn't do the workforce adaptation and transitions. We didn't manage that very well. And so if we didn't, the scale of that in the case of globalization was not anywhere close to as substantial as it will be with automation. So number two is to think about these work transitions and how we enable and make it easy for workers to do that. That's number two. The third thing that I worry about are the implications on wages. So while I said at the beginning that there'll be enough work, at least for the next several decades, and that's not what I worry about. I do worry about the wage implications, however. And I worry about that for a couple of reasons. One is that we know that many of the growing occupations, as well as the very hard to automate activities. So think a teacher, think a childcare minder, think those kinds of activities. Have tended to be occupations that at least the current labor market dynamics don't reward very well. Those have tended to be the kind of the lower wage occupations. Unlike many of the occupations that are easy to automate, think accounting, for example, where those have tended to be many of the middle wage jobs. So the effect, even if there is enough work, of the shift to these growing activities like care work and also to these occupations that are harder to automate could in fact have a downward draft and impact on wages. So, and I worry about that. I also worry about the impact on wages when you think about even when we're complementing work, because one of the things that happens when even if you don't replace a job, but you complement some portion of it, well, two things can happen. In some cases, that job becomes even more valuable because the complementing with technology makes it incredibly more productive and incredibly more valuable. And so the person doing that work actually gains a lot in kind of impact on wages and so forth. But the other thing at the other end of the spectrum can also happen where the technology complements the value adding, if you like, part of that occupation. And what remains behind is much, much more commoditized, even though a human is still doing it. That could have the effect on wages of also depressing those wages. So this question about how we work through our wage impact dynamics, even when there is enough work, is something we should think about, especially at a time when we're all quite concerned about inequality and so forth. Let me mention one more thing, Wendell. The fourth thing that I worry about and we need to think about is how we actually redesign work and the workplace itself. Because we know that whenever people are working alongside machines and machines become part of our work environment, how that work is actually organized is actually fundamentally important. I think we've all come to learn through this COVID crisis another reason to think about how we organize for work, which is for health and safety. So in a world in which we're going to have to rethink the workplace, how workflows happen, not just because of technology, at least for the moment anyway, also because of COVID, the redesigning of work in the workplace is also an important thing for us to think about. So these are all things to think about in this transition. So while I don't worry as much about do we face a jobless future, I think these four things are things we're going to have to work on if this is going to end up in a wonderful place. So that's the quick sort of snapshot on this work question. I'm sure there'll be questions about that. I should mention two other things that we've been thinking a lot about when it comes to the future of work. One is how all of this sort of plays out in particular places and geographies. And we've done some deep work looking at the US and in Europe. And as part of this work, Wendell, we've ended up, I didn't know this before, but now I do, how many counties there are in America. I think it's something like 3,149 because we went sort of county by county trying to understand the labor market dynamics in each of those counties in terms of how labor markets are working today, but also to understand what might be the impacts of technology and other forces going forward. And I should say, and we did something somewhat similar in Europe as well, just to understand the dynamics, but I'll just give you some of the interesting highlights, at least from the US work. What was fascinating about that is that even at a time when we, this is before COVID, of course, we were celebrating how jobs were growing since the last recession of 2008 and how job growth was great. What was striking about the job growth, though, is just how concentrated it was in the sense. So when you go county by county, we suddenly realized that something like roughly counties that make up about a third of the US population were generating slightly more than 2/3 of the job growth. And in fact, about 25 cities and a few dynamic growth hubs, some of them were small counties, were generating most of the growth. So if you were in one of this roughly a third of the country, you'd have seen quite profound and impressive job growth. If you were in the second, third group, you saw mostly flat job growth. If you were in the other third, you actually still saw job declines. And we called some of these counties an archetype sort of distressed Americana and so forth. The point about this is not only are the impacts of how the labor markets work different for different people in terms of where they are in the socioeconomic scale, they're also different by geography and place. So the way the labor markets work both today and going forward is profoundly impacted by skill, wage profile, and then the dynamics of geography. Raj Shetty and others have also cataloged much of this work looking at the differences by geography. We've done the same and also looked at what this might look like going forward. Similar dynamics turned out to be the case in Europe when you go through different micro regions within Europe. So these dynamics are profoundly important, which then takes us to, I think, a topic we'll discuss in conversation, which is, so what does any of this mean to how we might think about the social contract? So let me stop at that point, Wendell. I'm sure this has probably already generated some questions and things we can get into in conversation.
Great, great. Well, we will definitely get to what this means for the social contract, but let me focus in on a few things that you said here. So it's not the overall number of jobs being created that concerns you. It's not about work, but the impact on equality falls into three different areas, basically demographics, geography, and where you are in the workforce, who you are in the workforce. So who you are in the workforce, if I've got it correctly, you're saying it's largely that we're hollowing out the middle management jobs. And people are either being pushed to higher paid tech jobs, presuming they have the skills or they are reskilled to take those jobs, or they're being pushed down to service jobs where their overall income is lower. Have I got that correct?
Yes, the slight modification I'd make is not so much managerial middle jobs, but it's really middle wage jobs. Some of those are managerial, some are not, but there's a whole range of middle wage jobs that have been declining. And it's what economists and others and us have been calling kind of labor market polarization, where the top end does well, the bottom end does well in terms of employment, but doesn't do as well in terms of wages and income.
Right. So we are definitely getting an exacerbation of inequality just in that fact alone. And we don't have the normal progression in wages that we had sort of presumed, even though it was never quite true. And then the second thing is, oh, excuse me, you were going to say something?
Yeah, no, I was actually saying the progression in wages actually was true at a time. I remember, a couple of years ago, back in 2016, we had done a research project where we looked at wage progression in advanced economies, starting from the 60s. And you would have seen in that data set across most advanced economies that progressively each generation got better off. for a long time. And one of the things that we found in 2016 was that in the last decade or so, that's why we called the report poorer than their parents. That's when we started to see, this, wage stagnation, if you like, and it did a very polarized profile depending on where you are in the social income scale. So this wage stagnation question, never mind the inequality of it, but just the wage stagnation is a profoundly important and relatively recent phenomena, at least in many advanced economies.
And you also emphasize so that wage stagnation or even the declining of jobs may be very specific to regions. In fact, that was one of the things I was most taken about by your reports. The ways in which you broke down what would happen in the US and county by county and region by region, and the difference between what was going on in high-tech centers or agricultural centers or regions where the demographics were largely tilted toward the aging.
Yeah, no, it was quite striking. So as you went county by county, there are a few patterns. Some of those are where the growth was spectacular, were either a few large cities, not all of them, some of them. So because you have the Detroits and other places in there too that aren't doing as well. But you had mostly a few large cities. You also had some very dynamic small growth hubs. Some of those, for example, happen to be small local towns where fracking activity, for example, was going on. And so if you were in that locale, the dynamism there was pretty high. And then you also had some other sort of dynamic small hubs that were either where there was a location of a large data center or some economic activity that had located itself there. And so the dynamism was quite high. So there were all these kind of profiles and patterns. So it's a little bit more than just simply saying cities versus rural. You have to actually understand what was actually the economic dynamics going on in that particular locale to see the differences.
Yeah. The other thing that jumped out at me when I looked at your reports was the differences between the EU and the United States. Maybe you can speak a little bit more about that, but I particularly noticed that factors in aging and migration patterns between the United States and Europe would actually be significant in terms of how this all plays out, or at least how we anticipate it to play out based on existing trends.
That is correct. I have to say, one of the things that was surprising, and many of us hadn't quite appreciated the extent of it, is that because we always think of the US as a very mobile workforce where there's a lot of movement. Well, that was historically true, but that mobility has actually declined. And in fact, fewer people, and we looked at, for example, how many people were moving from, in a couple of ways, moving city, moving county, moving state. And we found that had actually slowed down dramatically in the last couple of decades compared to what it used to be. And in Europe, dynamism was actually surprisingly a little bit trending up, more so than it was in the US. So on dynamism, there was quite a difference. In Europe, there was also one of the other differences was that the nature of the dynamic hubs or micro regions that were growing had a slightly different profile than the ones in the US. Because they tended to be not so much high tech, but a few industrial manufacturing hubs, because manufacturing has stayed relatively robust, at least relatively in parts of Europe. So you had sort of dynamism in those places. So there was some, and then the aging profile was actually different. In fact, in Europe, one of the striking conclusions that we had was that Europe may actually have a shortage of workers, in fact, actually, in the very near term, in terms of the kind of demand on labor that you could expect over the next decade or two, which is quite different than the profile you'd see in the US, partly because the demographic profiles are quite different. The other thing we should perhaps talk about also, Wendell, is this issue of the social contract, because I think it's quite an important part of this, because we looked at, in fact, the report itself is actually called the Social Contract in the 21st Century. Now, as you know, the social contract is a deeply philosophical concept that's been around for many, many years. But we took a very economic view to it and examined this across 22 OECD countries. And we were trying to understand at least how this had changed in the 21st century across these 22 countries. And we're looking at it in three ways: how it had changed for individuals as workers, individuals as consumers or households that consume products and services, and then third, from the point of view of individuals as savers who are anticipating a future. And the results were quite interesting. So I'll just summarize quickly. From a work standpoint, the story of the 21st century is a mixed one. So it's great in terms of the number of jobs that have been created. So it's interesting that despite even the recession of 2008, and of course all of this is pre-COVID, the job growth in these countries, including the United States, was actually unprecedented, actually. So jobs were very, very high. So what was more mixed was the questions around, okay, so how did wages do in that period? Mixed. Things like work security and fragility had actually gone up in that period. And part of the reason the work and income fragility had gone up was because in most countries, including the United States, most of the net new jobs that have been created were actually of an alternative variety. What do I mean by that? Alternative in terms of either contingent work, part-time work, gig work, and those kinds of different varieties of work compared to, say, traditional full-time jobs. So that was kind of the work story. The consumption story of people as consumers was also very striking. It was actually a story of two halves in a way that has a profound impact on the social contract. The good half of that consumer story was that the cost of things like cars, white goods, electronics, furniture had dropped dramatically over the last 20 years. In fact, they've become incredibly cheap. In large part, actually, quite frankly, due to globalization. And these are highly tradable, highly competed products. And in fact, their cost had plummeted compared to inflation or whatever you want to index it to. So this is a wonderful story from a consumption standpoint. So that's the good half of the consumption story. The really challenging part of the consumption story across all these countries was how a few basics like housing, education, and in some countries, health, and depending on where you are, transportation, the cost of those things had gone up dramatically, far, far exceeding inflation or consumer price indices. And in fact, they'd gone up so much that for some, if you were in the bottom half of the income scale, half the income deciles, these have actually come to consume huge portions of your income, and in some cases, the majority of it. So the story about how the cost of housing and education and healthcare, again, they vary a little bit which country you're in. In the United States, the big ones were housing, education, and healthcare had gone up spectacularly and made up, far, far exceeding income gains or growth or for many, many households. This was very, very hard story. It was more dramatic than we expected. And then if you look at individuals as savers, this was also mostly a tough story because what had happened is that many more people were in debt. Many more people were saving a lot less. In fact, on average, across all these 22 countries, it obviously varies from country to country. You could say, in all the different ways that people save, whether it's their own savings or pensions or any of the mechanisms by which people save for the future, the average person had savings that would cover about 10 years of retirement, when in fact, most people are going to be retired for an average of about 20 years. So there was half there for retirement and for the future. And the thing about the savings and the levels of debt, by the way, it was actually interesting because what we found was that generally levels of debt had actually gone up for bottom half of the income scale. So the size of the debt had gone up. But the profile also of who was in debt had changed. So for example, in the United States, we actually found that surprisingly, the people who were indebted were younger and often also educated, which is kind of different from what you might have seen in previous eras. So this is quite striking. And across all of these, Wendell, there was a sense that a lot of institutions had actually retreated, as it were. So the kind of supports that might have been provided by either governments or institutions of one sort or another, private or whatever the case, was becoming less and less in most countries. So this is the way in which some of the social contract had changed. In fact, we had actually identified about 10 groups. So generally, so just to summarize, if you looked at the 21st century so far, if you were across all the OECD countries we looked at, there was a group of about 150 million people for whom this had turned out very well, actually. And if you're in that 150 where your typical profile was you were relatively well-educated, high wage, and working certain sectors and living in certain locales, this was actually great. Whereas if you were in the other roughly 500 million, where you could have been characterized by the fact that you were, less educated, low wage, lived in particular geographies, often female, very often a minority, and so on, this wasn't great.
Right. So it's clear that if you really get into the weeds of it, the role of citizens as wage earners, as consumers, as savers, those are all intricately bound up with each other, and they affect each other. And what I did notice about that report, though, was that it was written before COVID. And interestingly, not all those reports were written before COVID. You took COVID into account in considering the future of work in the EU. But that just tells me that you and your team are trying to think through what's the impact of COVID on trends that you saw up to COVID and trends that you anticipate we will witness over the next few years. So I'd love for you to share some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, we're starting to get our arms around the impacts of COVID on labor markets. And here are some of the highlights, and we've actually started to write about some of this, Wendell. So if you take the United States, and the patterns for Europe are actually quite similar, but I certainly remember, at least off the top of my head, the numbers for the United States. So I'll describe those. And the European ones are directionally similar, although slightly better, actually. But let me describe the US. So if you take the US, something like about a third of the workers in the United States are actually economically vulnerable to COVID work impacts. And what do I mean by economically vulnerable? So the third consists of people who have either already been laid off or have been furloughed or are experiencing reduced work hours or reduced wages for some combination of reasons. That's a much larger number than the unemployment data suggests, but that's vulnerability. That vulnerability is a function of either because of the shutdowns that we've had, so people can't go to work, or because demand in that sector has dropped dramatically. Think hospitality, for example, which has been very, very, very high hit. Or think about some parts of retail, for example. So that's roughly a third. That's a very large number. And when you look at that third in the United States, close to 80% of it, I think the number is something like 77% precisely, but it's close to, just call it 80% of it, of those people have tended to be people who are actually in low wage jobs. In other words, these are people who earn less than $40,000 a year, which is quite striking, the vast majority of them. And also they're disproportionately people of color, just because of the occupation profiles of who's typically been in what occupations in what sectors. So they tend to be disproportionate people of color, which is quite striking. The other thing that's also striking, Wendell, is we all, if you read the popular press, you would think everybody can work from home. Well, that's actually not true. In fact, when you look at it, The range is by, various people have tried to estimate who can actually do their work from home, can work actually be done remotely and from home. Our estimates suggest it's about 20%. I've seen estimates as high as 33% or 30%, but no one is saying 100%. So even if you take the upper end of that and say, well, a third of the people can work from home, there's still another 2/3 who actually, to do work, have to show up somewhere in some physical place. So if you'd read the news, you'd think everybody is spending time on Zoom like we are and working this way. That's actually a minority of people. So we have to think about these work effects, which are quite profound. And we see similar patterns in Europe too. The numbers are obviously slightly different because of the mix of the economy and the labor markets. But this is what we're seeing as we go through COVID.
So COVID seems to have speeded up a number of trends that existed beforehand. One of the trends that jumps to mind for me is that the percentage of productivity gains that went to wages versus going to the owners of capital, which really include any of us who own stocks, but obviously it's disproportionate from depending on who you are in the digital economy, that the percentage going to wages has really been decreasing. And therefore, for the owners of capital, there is a clear-cut value in not only getting rid of worker headaches or ongoing benefits to workers, but also that all productivity gains then go to increasing productivity gains, profits, as they can be shown to stockholders. So I wonder if this has come up at all in your reflections as far as COVID goes, and whether this is really creating an opportunity to automate jobs more quickly than might have been otherwise.
Well, it is the case that we've seen a lot of the trends accelerate, actually. And in some ways, I think of COVID as having done two things when it comes to labor markets. One is to perhaps accelerate the trends, and the other is also to more expose the trends that were already not so much in everybody's attention. So what has been accelerated? Clearly automation. If you hear what most business executives are talking about, there's a clear trend. We did a survey, for example, try to understand how are executives thinking about automation and so forth. And one of the things that came up is an inclination to accelerate automation. We've also seen an inclination to accelerate more varieties of work. So think about how many of us are living today, which is we now have things delivered to our houses and so forth because we can't go out. So we've actually seen some jobs related to delivery and logistics also start to grow in a much more accelerated way than they might have before. So there's been an acceleration, but I want to come back to the question of your capital versus labor question. I think this question is actually, it should always be discussed in two parts, Wendell, because there's clearly one part which says, of course, when there's more technology, more automation, the owners of capital tend to do better until the returns to capital go up if you happen to own assets or that relate to that capital. That is certainly the case, and we've seen that in the stock market appreciations and all of that. So you might, there might be something that's not so good about that. But there's another part of this capital labor question, which is has been changing for a very long time. And in fact, economists, we wrote a paper on this, on the labor share of income, where the capital labor question has been changing for a very long time. A way to think about it, think about a factory in 1900 versus a factory today. A factory in 1900, almost all the inputs into that factory to get an output of anything were almost all labor. Whereas if you take a factory today, yes, some of the inputs are labor, but some of the inputs are capital. So in other words, the factor inputs we need to get a unit of economic output, that mix has been changing over time, mostly due to technological progress. So what that means is, and we do that because it drives productivity, and we need productivity growth. So the question is, in a world in which the inputs we need to get our economic output are shifting in that way, how do we make sure people can still participate in the gains of that output? And we've seen, for example, companies that are very high in intangibles, high in capital, are the ones doing well. Now, if for most people, the way they participate in the economy is primarily through their labor, and yet the economy is generating output based on capital and intangibles, how do people then participate in those gains? So you've started to see people talk about, so should we think about these issues of pre-distribution and other ways to have people participate, more stock ownership, more asset ownership? Because if we can no longer participate purely through labor, or the labor portion is declining, how else can people participate in the gains of the economy? This is actually quite a profound question, actually, that we're going to need to grapple with as the economy progresses, because we're certainly not going to use less technology going forward, and that's so we're going to have to think about ways to grapple with that.
Well, clearly you've raised so many different topics here, and we could dive into them, and they beg so many secondary and tertiary questions that we aren't going to get to in this hour. But I did want to turn to one other subject before turning this over for some Q&A with those who have joined us today. And that's the Global South in particular. So we have talked already about in the EU and America, it's not a question of overall job numbers necessarily or productivity gains, but it is an exacerbation of the polarization and who is affected and who will not be affected by the impact of technological deployments. But now we have this question about what is that going to mean for the poor nations, the indigenous communities, the marginalized communities that are not necessarily in Europe or America? Will that unevenness be so strong that, for example, large portions of Africa might be devastated? I mean, certainly there are countries in Africa that have smart cities that are leapfrogging ahead, but there is this broader concern about what's going to be the international impact here on underserved populations.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad you asked this question, Wendell. It's an important one. And I think, again, we find, and at least I find, that it's a mixed story. So let me start with the positive and then the challenging parts of that, of the questions for the Global South. The positive story is as follows, which is, it is the case, actually, that inequality between the Global North and the Global South is actually narrowed in the last 20 years. It actually has. And that's largely a story of more people coming out of poverty in China, in India, and even Africa. For example, if you look at the people who are now considered in the consuming class, meaning that they earn enough above subsistence in order to purchase consumer goods, cars, and those kinds of things, that number has actually grown even in Africa, in India and China. So in that sense, inequality between nations, between the Global North and Global South, is actually improved. And I think that should be celebrated. It's largely a function of those countries plugging into the global economy, becoming part of the global economy, and so forth. That's a good story. There are some challenges, however, as you pointed out, which is even in those places, that hasn't lifted everybody, depending on which part of those countries you're in, which part of those regions you're in, and even which countries. We know that, for example, if you look at developing countries, many of them that are in the within the global kind of the economic ecosystem of large successful countries have tended to do well. So think of a Cambodia and a Vietnam, which are now kind of part of the Chinese ecosystem and value chains and supply chains. They've tended to do well. Think of a Mexico and others who are kind of part of the northern. So countries that have kind of are part of around these larger economies that are growing and get plugged into those supply chain and value chains have tended to do well. Countries that are not part of that, in fact, are quite isolated, have done terribly. And you worry about, so what's going to be the path for those countries? and those small regions. Think of Bangladesh, think of the countries like that. Similarly, one of the things you worry about from a technological standpoint is that it used to be that the story for the path for how poor countries developed or grew, and you could even argue China itself is a version of this story, is that those countries typically took the path of industrialization. They would become a cheap source of labor for some other country overseas somewhere, and that was almost their pathway into the global economy. Well, that pathway is not as available as it used to be, actually, as a way to get into the global economy, partly because of technology. So, there's actually less and less offshoring where people are chasing cheap labor these days. It still happens, but there isn't as much of it today as you might have seen in 1995 or 2000, for example. People do that locally or use technology to do that, 3D printing and so forth. You've seen all the articles about reshoring. So there's a little bit less of that. There's also less of that available if you're not, as I said, if you're not plugged into other people's global supply chains. In fact, this is something that economists like Danny Roderick and others have been writing about recently, which is this idea of premature deindustrialization, where you could industrialize and run on that for quite a while if you're a pure poor country to get into the global system. But it looks like the point where that stops is happening earlier and earlier, and in some countries it's not even available to them to begin with. So this raises a very profound question about, for those particularly poor countries, and in fact the poorest regions of the global south, what happens to them? In a funny sort of way, and well, not a funny, but it's an ironic sort of way, it's not dissimilar to the question about particular micro regions or counties in America who are not part of the amazing story that you see at the national level, but are actually in these small places. This is a version of that playing out globally, where these micro regions, micro countries, or in some cases large countries, are just left behind.
Maybe we'll get a few minutes to come back to that, but in the meantime, I'd like to see if there's any questions from those who are listening in today. If you do have a question, please put it in the chat, and then I will call upon you. I see something here from Kenneth Miller. Kenneth, are you able to jump in, or should I read your question? Okay, so I'm gonna read Kenneth's question, and it was there any attempt to categorize the 2,000 tasks by impact on job satisfaction, and how replacing certain tasks may decrease satisfaction? I think this is also more broadly about, well, if we are polarizing who's advantaged and who's disadvantaged, are we actually also polarizing satisfaction or not?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Kenneth. It's actually a very important question. We didn't look at that question, but I know others have. And if you look at the literature and the research on satisfaction, it gets at some of these questions about satisfaction and even dignity. So we know that in some occupations and some of those tasks, when the automation of tasks is enhancing the occupation and making that worker even more productive or do even more, at least the literature suggests the satisfaction actually goes up. Whereas in occupations where the complementing by technology is mostly, where the technology is mostly doing the value-added portions of the work, and what's left over is much, much more mundane, satisfaction is actually potentially low, and even arguably even the sense of dignity in doing that work is quite different. So that's why even as we get excited about technology complementing work, even if it doesn't replace it, we really should think about these questions of satisfaction, because they don't all play out exactly the same way for every occupation.
So our next question is from Christina Kolklaw. Before I read her question, let me just mention that she's going to be one of our future webcast speakers. Christina has a remarkable understanding of the impact of AI on workers. And she writes, great session regarding skills. As more and more workers are on precarious contracts, who will pay for the needed and continuous training for all workers?
Thank you, Christina. That's actually one of the toughest questions, because one of the things that's happened is partly because of technology, partly because, as I'm sure issues you know well, Christina, like work fissuring, for example, and all these alternative varieties of work. One of the things that happens is those varieties of work increase. It kind of breaks the structure of how training, worker training is typically provided. And so, first of all, there's already less of it anyway, but those trends like fissuring and alternative varieties of work further lower the possibilities of work training. So then it becomes a real question as to, so who pays for that? You may already know this, but it's actually quite striking as you look across the OECD countries. The US actually provides the least as a percentage of GDP of government supports for on-the-job work training. It's actually provides the lowest. But generally, most OECD countries have actually been decreasing anyway the amounts of supports for on-the-job training. So I actually think one of the things that we perhaps could think about is, should there be new kind of incentives put in place to increase what you might call investments in human capital, much like we have incentives for companies to invest in capital, tax write-offs and in R&D tax credits, et cetera. Should there be something similar for when companies and employers to encourage them to invest in building human capital?
So this already gives you a taste of some of the exciting topics we're going to get involved with in greater depth with Christina in a few weeks. Another question is from Cordell Green. Cordell is one of the advisors to the AI Inequality Project. And Cordell asks, what about the value of personal services such as tourism? Will the labor value proposition increase?
Well, I think, personal services in general is an interesting category, because a lot of personal services from a technological standpoint have tended to be some of the harder things to automate. And so they're likely to persist. The challenge with personal services is that there's such a wide variety of them, some where the labor markets value that work and some where they don't. So tourism might actually be one of those where the proposition is actually valuable economically, and so people are prepared to pay for them. But we know of other personal services, if you like, where the market, we may all think they're very, very important, but the labor markets don't value as much. Think about childcare, for example. We all think it's one of the most humane things that we can provide by humans, but labor markets for childcare are not great. Think about teachers. We all think teachers are some of the most important people in our society, but we don't pay teachers very well. So there seems to be in some of our labor market occupations where these very personal, very human activities that we value don't always, that doesn't always get reflected in the way our labor markets value these things. But I think tourism is actually one where we would value them, because there's a market for that and people tend to want to pay for things when they're traveling and experiencing, having tourism experiences.
Presuming we can get out of Hawk and actually travel again soon. Eugenio Garcia, who's a Brazilian diplomat, asks, do you see the prospect of AI and work being discussed by the United Nations to possibly adopt in the near future governance tools to mitigate risks in this area?
I think, Eugenio, you might be better placed to help us think through this, actually, because I think one of the things that's hard, and I know, Wendell, you're working on this question too, which is the question of governance for AI is actually very complicated, because it spans not just these issues of AI and work, which may be some of the somewhat easier ones, but also issues of use and misuse, which gets to issues of national security and other things. So the governance questions for AI are quite complicated. And I think at the UN level, the UN has tended not to be as involved, or at least directly effective, in labor markets. So even when it comes to the question of AI and work, I don't know to what role the UN could play in that, partly because that tends to operate at the level of national labor market and, quite frankly, local labor market dynamics. I think where the UN could play a role perhaps is to think about principles, to think about embedding the goals and aspirations when it comes to work and other things in things like the SDGs perhaps, and provide at least a guiding principles. But when it comes to kind of enforceable governance mechanisms, I'm not so sure. But others who are much more savvy about how these diplomatic arenas work and perhaps develop a point of view. Wendell, you know something about these things. You're thinking about them. I know that.
I am, but rather than delve into them today, I know we just have a couple more minutes. So I'm going to give you a closing question, just because this is hopefully not the end of our involvement with you, but at least the end of today's webcast. And that's the ways in which you have been thinking that we can shape the future in regards to these issues around the future of work, and perhaps more importantly, the reinforcing or creation of even new elements of a social contract for the future. So what would you suggest that we focus on in addition to some of the proposals you've already put forward?
Well, I think I would actually say we should tackle this with a sense of optimism, actually, because I think these technologies can actually have a profoundly positive impact on humans and life in the 21st century. I mean, think about the potential contributions to economic growth, to even, we didn't even get to topics like the role that AI can play in advancing the SDGs. So there's a lot of positive things that could come out of this. I think the real question is how we make sure that everybody gets to participate and benefit from the profound impacts. I mean, I think so far we haven't done too well in the 21st century. That's why we wanted to examine this question of the social contract. But I think the good thing is that the way our economies work, they don't work in their own right. I mean, we create the rules, we create the principles. Capitalism and market economics have always changed. If you look at the way capitalism was before, say the 1970s, it was quite different. So we can always revise the rules. We can always work to reform the rules. We can always work to make sure that these persistent, tough challenges like inequality don't persist. Those choices, I think, are up to us, either as people who think about these things, or as citizens, or people who participate. This should work the way we want, while getting all the benefits that these technologies can provide. So I think that's the work for us to all do.
Well, unfortunately, our time has run out, even as I see some wonderful questions from colleagues such as Mara Kavdra and Volha Litvinek and others. But you have done just a wonderful job of providing us with a really broad canvas of the considerations, packed full of information and insights. And I can't tell you how pleased we are to have had you with us today. And I invite everyone else listening in to join us for future podcasts and webcasts, all of which will be made available on our website at the Carnegie Council.
And Wendell, thank you for having me. Much of what I described today I drew from the reports that we publish. And by the way, these are all freely available. Happy, you can download them to get more details and some of the data and insights that I was summarizing here.
So where should people go to download those reports?
If they go to the McKinsey Global Institute website, or even if you go onto the internet, just simply search MGI social contract, it'll probably take you to the report. If you go to if you search MGI future of work in the United States, it'll probably take you to the report. MGI future work in Europe, it'll take you to the report. Yeah, these are all freely downloadable, so you can get them.
Great. Well, thank you ever so much, James. I'm so pleased that you could kick off this web series for us.
And Wendell, thank you for having me. It's always such a pleasure to talk with you. And I always learn a lot when I speak with you. That's why I'm sad we didn't get a chance to hear from you on some of these governance questions. I'd have loved to hear you answer that question, actually.
Well, maybe we'll get to them in other webcasts. But again, thank you.
Thank you.